Ladies and gentlemen, I am extremely pleased to welcome all of you to our third annual CeBIL Symposium and our first using an online platform. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathy Liddell and I'm the Director of the Centre for Law, Medicine and Life Sciences here in Cambridge. We're delighted to be hosting this symposium with Professor Timo Mintzen and the CeBIL Consortium. Timo will tell you a little more about this collaboration in a moment. As you know, the focus of our symposium is orphan drug innovation, which is crucial to helping millions of people affected by rare diseases. Innovation in this field is notoriously difficult because each rare illness has such a small market of patients, making it difficult to conduct statistically valid clinical trials or to sell therapeutics in volume. There are a number of legal frameworks, such as the US Orphan Drug Act of 1983, and the more recent EU Orphan Drug Regulation of 2000, which try to incentivize orphan drug innovation. An important question is whether these legal frameworks are working well. To what extent are they delivering solutions for patients? And are these solutions sufficiently affordable? Are generics coming into the market quickly enough? Is the R&D overly focused on particular clinical needs, such as cancer? This symposium seeks to explore these questions and identify the most pressing priorities in orphan drug innovation, and whether and how social science research, particularly legal research, can help meet these needs. To structure our discussion, we will have two sessions today with a short break in between. In session one, 3 speakers will give short presentations on key issues. And in session 2, we'll have a panel discussion with 3 additional experts. After each session, we hope that you will take the opportunity to offer your thoughts and questions. So let me just mention a couple of Zoom housekeeping points. This event is being recorded, and so to get a high quality recording, we would be grateful if audience members could keep their microphones and cameras off. If an audience member would like to ask a question, please could you write your question using the question and answer function, which is found at the bottom of the Zoom screen. As we understand, other audience members will be able to see those questions and upvote if they would also like to hear the answer. We will hold all questions and put them to the speakers during the open discussion rather than after each presentation. So now I will hand over to Timo Mintzen, but just before I do, may I just thank you all for joining us. Our registration records prior to this event showed that we were going to be joined by a wonderfully diverse set of people, mostly from the UK and Europe, but also the 4 corners of the world, including Brazil, Argentina, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, the United States, not to mention even Egypt, the Ukraine, India, and many more places. We hope that all these registrants have managed to navigate the online platform. This is certainly the beauty of Zoom, that we can reach out so far, and we hope you get a lot from the event. Over to you, Timo.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. I can only second the remarks by my dear colleague, Kathy Liddell. What a wonderful crowd we could gather today to discuss such a hot topic, and which is as exciting and relevant as it is complex, delicate, and elusive. My name is Timo Mintzen. I'm Professor of Law and the Founding Director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Biomedical Innovation Law, CeBIL, at the University of Copenhagen. CeBIL is an international research center exploring a great variety of legal and socioeconomic challenges posed by the rapid developments in biomedical innovation in Denmark and around the globe. It became operative in January 2018, and it unites some of the world's leading research institutions in interdisciplinary collaboration and also engages a broad variety of stakeholders. CeBIL is involved in a great variety of scientifically independent research endeavors, including major projects funded by the Norwegian Research Council, for example, on sustainable and responsible drug development, as well as projects funded by the Danish Research Council, which all focus on the intersection of law, ethics, and technology in the area of different legal pressure areas. And only recently, we have started a project on health AI, bias and discrimination, as well as a collaboration between CeBIL and the Danish Medicines Agency's Data Analytics Center in a project funded by the Danish Innovation Foundation on neglected populations. So the REPACT project aims to develop data-driven methods to identify underrepresented populations in clinical trials and assesses the fit of the legal framework to accommodate possible solutions considering incentives, obligations, and governance. And of course, it is very much related to this topic of today's event. And CeBIL's biggest research project, however, is the interdisciplinary international CeBIL collaborative research program, which has received 35 million Danish crowns, a generous grant by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which pays most of the bills for our party today. And as the PI and grant recipient, I'm of course very grateful for this. And it will run for 5 years, and it's made up of 6 work packages, and it includes world-renowned international research partners, among them, of course, our great colleagues from the University of Cambridge, the University of Copenhagen, Harvard Law School, Harvard Medical School, and the University of Michigan. As well as, of course, also prominent advisors from inter alia, the Max Planck Institute, Oxford University, and MIT. The work packages cover 5 topic areas of biomedical innovation, and they run from antimicrobial resistance to artificial intelligence to new uses of existing drugs, innovation and manufacturing of biologics, and of course, orphan drugs and rare diseases. And then we have a 6th synergy study that takes an interdisciplinary approach and combines legal science with real-world evidence and other policy considerations to contribute to a more holistic approach through the discussion of advancing biomedical innovations. Today, as Kathy introduced, we will focus on orphan drug innovation, which is among the most important challenges in the health and life sciences. And as we already heard, also an extremely topical area in light of technological developments, which give us a lot of opportunities, but also create challenges, and the recent studies and EU reports that we could read. I trust that our expert speakers will give you some very good examples today through which we will come to understand the needs and priorities better. So without further delay, it is time now to introduce the first speaker for the first session. And we couldn't have found anyone better. So Tira de Jong is and please excuse me if I pronounce your name not correctly. So Tira de Jong is a principal consultant at Technopolis with over 18 years of experience in research and consulting. Her main areas of expertise are pharmaceutical legislation and innovation, medical research, health systems and policy analysis, and global health. She has gathered an impressive experience in performing studies, program evaluations, and impact assessments for a range of organizations and many clients. She is currently the project leader for key projects concerning pharmaceutical regulation, vaccine communication, translational research, and sexual and reproductive health. She was, and that is very interesting, the project leader for the evaluation study for the EU Orphan Drug Regulation for incentivizing the development of medicines for rare diseases. So we could really not have found a better speaker, and we're very happy to have you with us. We're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that very flattering and kind introduction, Timo. And also thank you, Kathy, for both of you for inviting me here today. It is indeed my pleasure to tell you a little bit about the work that we have done for the European Commission. And I have some slides prepared for that, which I will now attempt to share with you. Let's see if that is all working as it should. I think it is. Can you confirm, Timo, that it's working? Or yeah, I see Kathy shake her head, so I guess that works. So indeed, I work for a company that is called Technopolis Group, and Technopolis does public policy consulting, and we do quite a lot of work for the European Commission. And in 2017, if my memory serves me right, the Commission approached us as part of a tender if we could help with a study to support their own internal evaluation of the EU Orphan Regulation. That resulted in about 350-page report that is publicly available and was published 2 years ago, almost 3 years now, and which was the basis for the Commission's own evaluation. So what I want to do today is just show you a little bit of the things that we did in our study and what that has meant for where the Commission is in its thinking right now. So specifically what the Commission asked us to do is to answer, well, they had like 30 questions, I think, but you can boil them all down to what has the orphan regulation brought so far, at what costs and consequences has it done so, and is the regulation as it is today future-proof? So we spent about a year of hard work in trying to find some answers to that. I'm sure everybody here will already know all this, but I think it's helpful to just remind everybody a little bit of what the orphan regulation does. essentially the regulation offers a set of incentives that is designed to stimulate the development of new orphan medicines and promote access to these products. And it has a set of tools with which to do that. And the only one that I will focus on today, I think for this discussion, is a 10-year market exclusivity. I see my dear friend Sven is here today, and he will be able to explain you in a great level of detail how that works. But essentially, it is a form of intellectual property that gives the person or the company that has authorized or that has an authorized orphan medicine on the market a 10-year period during which no other company can come into that space. So what did our study find? And I apologize, I'm going to go quite fast because 350 pages in 10 minutes is a challenge. Some key level findings, we found that there's about 2,000 products that have received an orphan designation, meaning they are in some form of development, covering nearly 700 different conditions. At the time we did the study, 142 had already been approved, covering again 107 unique conditions. We found designations and authorizations in nearly all major therapeutic areas, covering a lot of diseases that are very, very rare indeed. But as with anything, policymaking is a difficult thing to do. I don't envy people who are involved in that business. For every positive that you get out of policy instruments, you will always encounter some problems, some of which you might be able to foresee, others that just materialize as time progresses. So I just want to pinpoint a few of those tension areas today because they feed into where the Commission's thinking currently is going. The first part is the issue of clustering. If you look at where authorized products are, give me just 1 minute. If you look at the pipeline of authorized products, but also the pipeline of products in development, you see that about 1/3 of all the designated products, because this chart currently is for any designation, regardless of whether it's on the market, involves anti-cancer medicines. Kathy already alluded to that before, and that's actually quite a lot. If you dig a little deeper into that, what you see at the level of indications is that clustering can be quite severe. We see that there's over 70 products that have received an orphan designation for AML. This is the top 8 or so. Most of these are forms of cancer, but you see there's also a lot of designations here for cystic fibrosis and for Duchenne. Of course, that's great news for people who are affected by these conditions, and they are some truly horrific conditions indeed. But it also shows that there are a lot of areas that are essentially untouched by this incentive for innovation, where there's no R&D activity happening at all. And this is not surprising. There are good reasons for it. A lot of that has to do with where the state of science is and where research agendas are focused. But it's undeniably true that some of this clustering is influenced by where there is greatest potential for profit. Nope. Yeah. So a second area that we looked at is, so how innovative are the medicines that are coming on the market today? And what this chart actually shows is how many of these designations have been for completely new conditions, that the committee that evaluates all of these applications says, we have never ever reviewed an application or approved an application for this before. And back when the regulation started, that obviously was true for almost all of these products, but that has very quickly dropped off. And now fewer than 1 in 5 products is for something that the committee has not seen before. And in fact, for only 28% of all currently, or in 2018, authorized orphan medicines, did the sponsor not have to show what they call significant benefit. And significant benefit is what you need to show if there is already an alternative treatment option on the market. So what this suggests is that this regulation is not sufficiently succeeding in encouraging really new innovation in areas where there is substantial unmet medical need. So this has led to suggestions that there is a need for additional or an alternative set of measures to achieve that. I'll go into that in a bit more detail shortly. A further area of tension is the repurposing of medicines. You often may hear these stories about unscrupulous companies that have effectively hijacked medicines that were already on the market, either because they had been approved for a different indication or because they were being used in hospital formulation. Then the company obtains an orphan designation and suddenly hikes up the prices. We found some of these examples, we described them in our report, but we wanted to take a more systematic look and say, how often is this actually happening? The data that we could use for that is what they call the legal basis of authorization. And we found that most of the orphan medicines that have been approved involve what they call new active substances. So you could argue that these are in fact completely innovative medicines and that the sponsor has had to do a substantial R&D investment for that. What it is not a measure of is that new product truly serving an unmet medical need, and does it have high therapeutic added value? We did also see there are some medicines that are definitely being reinvented, and there is currently no mechanism to reward these types of innovation, if you will, differently. And the analysis is a little bit flawed in the sense that we know that there are some products that fall under these egregious examples that still appear as new active substances because they were just never reviewed before. I know the issue of indication stacking is on the program, so I won't waste too much time on it other than to show the concern here is how should you reward innovation if a product has already been approved for one indication and is then shown to be effective also in another indication, because the system is set up such that you can receive multiple rewards for that, and these rewards can be cumulative. And that can lead to inefficiencies and delayed generic entry. Now, we drew a lot of conclusions from this, and the Commission agreed on almost all of these conclusions with us. So the ones that I give you here are both ours and that of the Commission. So we found that the regulation substantially contributed to the development of and also the access to orphan medicines and has overall improved the R&D climate, both in the public and private sectors. Where the news is less good is what I showed you before. It has not sufficiently succeeded in supporting development in areas where the need for medicines is greatest. And there are some issues that I haven't gone into much detail, but when we talk later on about salami slicing, when Sven will talk us through that, that concerns also the need to future-proof the regulation against some scientific developments around, for instance, personalized medicine. And we found inefficiencies and undesirable consequences in many different areas. And I think the key one there is that there is no clear linkage between, on the one hand, the quality of innovation or the amount of effort that a company has to put in and the size of the reward on the other hand. So the conclusion is economic incentives remain relevant to encourage development of medicines for rare diseases, but likely are also given where they are not needed. And we need some solutions that are going to strike the right balance between fostering innovation on one hand, but ensuring availability of and access to medicines for patients on the other. What comes next? I just need one more minute, then I'll be done. The Inception, right now, the Commission is going through a process called an impact assessment. They have developed something called the Inception impact assessment, in which they put forward a set of policy proposals. Now, every single one of the proposals that they have put forward includes changes. Sometimes you will see that there is an option that says no change. That clearly is not on the menu anymore. So the Commission has said, at any rate, what we will do in going forward is that we will introduce formalized criteria to determine what constitutes an unmet medical need, so that we are able to systematically identify products that address these needs. They want to introduce more flexible designation criteria to accommodate some of these scientific developments and take into account, if you have this issue of multiple indications, the cumulative number of people affected by all rare conditions under a product. And in exchange, they will offer new incentives such as enhanced regulatory support and improved efficiency of procedures. But that's not where they stop. There are 4 specific proposals under consideration right now.
I think you would have to wrap up soon, Tira.
I will. This is my last slide. So The base option that they have here to say we leave almost everything unchanged. The only thing that we are going to work on is to differentiate the period of market exclusivity depending on the type of development. Now, the second option takes that a level further and says we may also introduce changes to the threshold or introduce different criteria to make a product eligible. And where I think it gets really interesting is under options 3 and 4, where they say we may introduce new sets of incentives for products that address the greatest unmet medical needs. Or we can even go option 4 to a point where market exclusivity no longer becomes the default option, but we tailor the incentives, and that can include completely different incentives to the specific product characteristics.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Is that it?
Well, I mean, I just basically to let you know that this is where the Commission is right now. They are working on this, and we expect to see what comes out of that process sometime next year.
Thank you. This was absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry that we have so little time for each talk, but this was absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned patients. Now we come to the next topic. Let's not forget about patients who are really very, very important, if not the most important players here. And we have a very good speaker here as well, Terkel Andersen, who was elected president of Eurodes Rare Diseases Europe in May 2003 and has been a member of the Eurodes board of directors since 1997, when the organization was founded. He had a broad experience in disability and health issues, and he was involved in many rare disease fields. Among other things, he also served as the president of the Danish Hemophilia Society. He was one of the founders of the Danish Alliance of Rare Disorders, and he was the first executive director of the Center for Rare Diseases and Disabilities of the Ministry of Social Affairs in Denmark, and served on the executive board of the World Federation of Hemophilia, and he was the chairman of the European Hemophilia Consortium. So we're very happy to have you with us, Terkel, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to share my screen. So just a minute. Yeah. So can you see my screen? It seems.
Yes.
So thank you very much for the invitation to talk at this important symposium. Just a few words to start with about Eurodes, the organization that I represent. As it says here, it's a rather big alliance of rare disease organizations. At this point, we have 970 member patient organizations from all over Europe, and including also national alliances of rare disease patient organizations. We have an outreach to more than 2,500 patient groups and diagnoses in the field of rare diseases. So I think we can say that we are pretty representative. We were founded in 1997, as already stated, but we did this because we could see that there were things on the horizon which could actually bring together Europe for a new launch of initiatives in the field of rare diseases, and in particular the adoption of the orphan drugs legislation. This was really a defining moment, since the EU legislation was the first to describe the challenge of rare diseases, and to do it from a European perspective, and with the figures that actually define rare diseases in a European context, which are not exactly the same as in other regulations over the world. Later, this important legislation was followed up by a number of specific initiatives in terms of recommendations, other decisions, regulations, and directives. I could mention in particular the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive from 2011, but also when it comes to therapies, different regulations on pediatric drugs, on advanced therapies, etc. The specificities of the rare disease area actually do persist 20 years after the adoption of the of the legislation or when it came into force. Rare diseases remain an area of high unmet needs with limited or no access to efficacious therapies, even though the knowledge base on the more than 6,000 rare diseases has developed dramatically. 2 years ago, we surveyed with our rare parameter panel of more than 10,000 rare disease patients how they perceive their treatment options. Only 5% replied to have access to really transformative therapies, with some exceptions like some enzyme replacement therapies and gene therapies, and mostly in the area of rare cancers. For the majority, the only treatments are non-specific symptomatic therapies, while 1/3 said that they have not access to any treatment at all. This said, there is little doubt that the Orphan Drug Regulation has been a major driver for accelerating research and development of rare disease therapies. The regulation has been quite productive, with now more than 200 products reaching a marketing authorization, and with an estimated potential impact for more than 6 million European citizens. But the regulation has not delivered on all parameters, and certainly not resulted in equal access to treatments across the estimated more than 6,000 rare diseases, let alone bringing rare disease patients to the same level of access to treatment as patients with more common conditions. Though the vast majority of genetic rare diseases emerge in childhood, most new drugs target the adult population. The regulation has been of most value to a limited number of diseases, as already stated by Tyra, although with a relatively high prevalence, while the most rare diseases have seen less impact. 55% of marketing authorizations have been given to diseases with a prevalence of 1 to 5 in 10,000. The ultra-rare diseases on the left side of the screen, with a prevalence of less than 1 in 100,000, make up 89% of all rare diseases, meaning that for more than 5,000 rare diseases, no treatments have been developed. There is, as also mentioned by Tyra, a clear tendency towards crowding of new products and therapies in a small number of rare diseases, such as disease areas such as oncology, hematology, and metabolic diseases. It is interesting that the proportion of orphan medicinal products with a marketing authorization in oncology is higher than the percentage of orphan designations in the same field. This demonstrates that a mature healthcare provision, as we see it in cancer, and programs to support progress in one area facilitates successful product development. It also indicates that the supply side, research and development, is not the only driver for investing in new therapies to be sponsored. The demand side is equally important. Even with a rich pipeline of orphan drug designations, projections made in the framework of the recently concluded Rare 2030 Foresight study show that we seem to be falling short of the target set by the International Research Consortium on Rare Diseases, ERDIRC. Back in 2017, ERDIRC assessed that it would be realistic to achieve 1,000 new therapies by 2027. Little indicates, unfortunately, that we will get there. When a new orphan drug has obtained a market authorization, there is no guarantee that patients can access treatment. These data will be published later this month in a report from the Imperial College of London, also part of the Rare 2030 project. The average delay between market authorization and patient availability for orphan drugs can be as short as 3.5 months in some countries, but also as long as 3.6 years in others. Each member state imposing its own HTA procedures results in significant delays and very often in no access at all. The average delay between market authorization and patient availability for orphan drugs for new medicinal products is generally longer for orphan medicinal products than for the more general new medicinal products. So our key recommendations for revising the Orphan Drug Regulation is that it is important to have an early stage multi-stakeholder identification of where the real unmet needs of the rare disease communities are, which rare diseases actually to target, and where to put priorities and investments, or as said, to diversify the incentives so that we get to a graduated system of incentives rewarding early dialogue and areas with no therapeutic options yet. But we could also consider things like introducing an element of incidence so that we make sure that we do not enter into the subset issue that Tyra also mentioned. There is a need also to think whether the CONT could play a more significant role in these discussions. So we think it would be important to strengthen the mandate of the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products, because giving it more competence, more power, and a say in all along the process, we believe that a much more intelligent way of using the incentives could be achieved. There is a need to rethink the whole ecosystem for research and development, and we should. Innovation and science around, in particular genetic diseases, holds a lot of promise to make us achieve much more in the coming 20 years than we have seen for the first 20 years of the regulation.
May I just ask you how many slides are left? This last slide?
I think there is only one or two more.
Yeah, but okay, but we need to wrap up soon. Thank you.
Yes. So we need to find ways to identify and target the unmet needs of rare diseases, and especially those which are ultra rare, and to create incentives which match this. We should adapt the current system to be more supportive in areas of unmet needs, foster innovation, and address the challenges of healthcare systems sustainability. This could include a graduated system of incentives as set, but we should also combine this with different areas of relevance to optimize the pathway from basic science through development and clinical testing to facilitate uptake and patient access. One such important field would be to rethink the evaluation of specialized medicinal products and their pricing, e.g. through an increased focus on real-world evidence generation after marketing authorization, and not least to encourage increased collaboration between countries on HTA and joint procurement. I hope that Brexit will not be a barrier to UK involvement in this or other many areas where we can do so much together. So access to high quality.
I think we're running out of time. We need to have a same time for each speaker. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yes, this was very interesting again. Thank you so much. And I hope we can get back to some of the issues as well during the discussion. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, which we will collect for the open discussion later on. So we get on to the next speaker before we get to the open discussion, and that is Jakob Westedt. Jakob Westedt is his PhD. He holds degrees in law and philosophy and wrote his PhD dissertation on patents and genome editing and open innovation. For the last couple of years, Jakob's research has focused on regulatory issues in the orphan drug domain as part of the CeBIL Novo Nordisk research program. And from April 2021, Jakob has devoted his time to collaboration between CeBIL and the Danish Medicines Agency in the REPAC project that I mentioned at the beginning, which is funded by the Danish Innovation Foundation on neglected populations. So Jakob, I'm very happy that you are here. And as your old supervisor, I'm of course also very proud that you are here. And I'm looking forward to your talk, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Timo, for the introduction. So yeah, can everybody see the slide? Great.
Yes.
Good. Then, well, thank you for two great presentations, which were very inspiring and touched upon a lot of the same issues that I will touch upon in my presentation, which goes more specifically into a few of them. See, where is the, sorry, there. Okay, so this talk, I will look at the issue of repositioning, which Tira also mentioned, because repositioning has been highlighted as one of the important ways of solving the issue of a lack of treatment options for patients with rare diseases. There was a Delphi study years ago made where I think there was an 82% consensus that repositioning was an important way to address this issue. But then we can ask ourselves the question, because another issue that has been raised also by Tira in the Technopolis report is the issue of salami slicing and the issue of high prices and prolongation of protection for rare diseases by having several periods of several designations stacked upon each other. So how do we distinguish between repositioning of drugs and salami slicing and indication stacking? And what can we do about it? So that's the basic question that I will jump into here. So just the definition, repositioning that we look on here is repositioning where we have a drug that already have a marketing approval, and then is repositioned for a new indication, either for a new population that it was not approved for before, or for a completely new disease. So that's what we call same condition repositioning or new condition repositioning. And all this is based on a recent article I wrote together with John Liddecote that has been accepted for publication in the Nordic Intellectual Property Law Review. That will also come a reference in the end, so you can look more into that if you feel like it. So first, if we look at the basic governance framework around repositioning, what's important to remember, then first it's important to remember that the orphan drug system is really important to repositioning, because one of the issues for repositioning, of course, well, how do you get some protection and enables your business model? Usually in the patent area, in the pharmaceutical area, it would be patents. But patents, they are granted on the basis of something being novel. So obviously, a repositioned drug might have issues with getting a really strong patent protection. But in the orphan drug domain and the orphan drug regulation, designations and the protection is granted based on demonstrating that there is a need. So therefore, the orphan drug regulation is really important to repositioning and to incentivize that. Another important part of this framework is the expert committee assessing whether a drug should have this designation as an orphan medicinal product. An expert committee looking at the scientific data behind the application and whether the application actually points to a new condition, or it's something that we have already seen and therefore have to demonstrate significant benefit and so forth, as Tira also mentioned in her presentation. One of the key components when addressing whether something is a kind of good repositioning or bad, as in salami slicing, indication stacking, that seems to have some negative connotations, is the concept of medical plausibility. When you apply for this designation, you have to demonstrate that the designation you apply for is actually a real disease, or not a subset of disease created artificially to obtain the protection. So there, the comp will look at this medical plausibility criteria and say, okay, are the way this condition is defined, is that actually sufficiently precise and unique, and not just some artificial way of creating a disease. So, okay, so when we got all that in place, then what is the problem? Then first we have salami slicing. Salami slicing, that was this thing that Sven will talk more about, where you create artificial subsets of diseases or populations in order to get below this threshold criteria of 5 and 10,000 patients, or in order to get multiple designations for your drug, so you can kind of have the protection from the market exclusivity, and consequently. There, the kind of the stop block for that should be the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products that sits and make this assessment. And they are very aware of this problem, and there's a guideline that they've made on it where they specify how this issue should be addressed. The other issue was the high prices that, you know, when you have a repositioned drug, then you already earn some money on this, then you reposition your drug, then what should the price on this new drug be? The issue there could translate that into, well, there's a discrepancy between the investment in research and development and the price that you charge for the drug. Maybe we could also reframe the salami slicing issue as the same kind of problem, as a problem of, well, there's a discrepancy between the investment you make in the new designation you get and the research and development investment you have made. So the point I want to get at is that in our study, we looked at the orphan drugs back from 2007 and until now, and then put it into this and assessed whether they had been repositioned and whether it was same condition repositioning or new condition repositioning. We found a sum total of 22% of repositioned drugs. And what we then looked at was what was anticipated in literature, because there's been a lot of arguments about that repositioning was an important innovation modality. And 22%, that is definitely in the lower end of what was anticipated in the articles from 2010 and until today. And in some studies, you don't count same condition repositioning, so repositioning for the same population as repositioning. So if you only count the new disease repositioning, then we are only at 11% repositioning, and that is very much lower than what was anticipated 10 years ago. So the whole hope that repositioning could save this area seems to be, well, shaky. Then the question is, the thing is, what should we do then? We find that, well, to make the incentives lower, given that repositioning is not really taking off, that seems counterintuitive. So solution, if we limit exclusivity, then, well, we have to ask ourselves, well, limiting exclusivity is based on this idea that there's some kind of overcompensation. But if we don't see very many repositioning, is there actually overcompensation? Because I would guess that, well, if industry saw that, okay, you can get a designation as an orphan drug with this repositioned drug fairly easy and without a lot of research and development investment, you would see more activity in this domain, but we don't. The other issue about shortening the exclusivity time is, well, there's no guarantee that there's generic competition. Also in the Technopolis report, I think you also point to the issue of generic competition and whether that it's difficult to really get going. But you might want to can comment on that later. And then there's finally the issue that, okay, but if we shorten the exclusivity time, well, will the prices actually be low? Will a company then just charge higher prices for a short amount of time? So
yeah, did your last slide. Sorry that I had to.
Yeah, almost. Yeah,
okay.
I'll get to.
We have to wrap up.
Of course, yeah. Another option would be to use more general legal tools that we've seen in Holland, in the Dutch competition authority. They've just fined Lidi and Pharma in July for excessive pricing. So instead of addressing this issue of salami slicing and so forth, then addressing the issue of a discrepancy between research and development costs and the price on medicines, and to use this general competition law tool to address that. Or we could consider to use more specialized initiatives. In Canada, they have this special board that looks at both patented medicines, but also medicines that has the benefit of orphan drug exclusivity. And they have introduced different criteria that they will apply in this area to keep prices down and to address these issues. So,
okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob. This was also extremely exciting, and I'm very sorry that I have to be such a ruthless enforcer of the time limitations, but you know, when you have been at so many academic conferences, you understand how important it is to respect the speaking time of the other speakers and to leave some time for break and discussion. So I really enjoyed all of the talks, really amazing, and I'm very sorry that I had to kind of cut through it a little bit at the end. But thank you very much. So we have now some space for discussion, and I know that Terkel also would like to make a few remarks that he didn't have the time to, and also have some questions here. As a good chair, I will not ask questions, so I will leave this to the audience. Terkel was said that he thinks we should keep some time to look at the demand side. If there is no or late uptake, no incentives will actually work. The conventional HTA system is inadequate to assess the new advanced therapies. Can you please allow some time to discuss during the open discussion? So what is your view on that? And please fill in, Terkel, if you want to elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I think other panelists can actually join in here. My point is that that getting to the point where we have really incentives for which work, we must make sure that that the market is actually also capable of creating a reimbursement system and making sure that the products actually reach the patients. And there we have some elements in both in the whole ecosystem around this, as well as in particular with the conventional HTA system that really do not meet the needs of this community.
You would like to comment on that, Tira, Jacob?
I mean, I see the points made. We haven't looked that far into what is happening at the HTA level nationally, because that really is more an issue of the different aspects of the national health systems. But it's not just the HTA, of course, that is blocking access in some ways. It's also selective market entry by the pharmaceutical companies who may not even opt to file for admission into certain markets. So that is one of the things that the Commission is actually also considering in the introduction of new incentives, to introduce a special set of incentives for sponsors that are willing to make their products available in all markets. Because we see now that some countries are just systematically left behind, and patients in some countries are very unlikely to get access to some of these medicines, at least within the first few years after they have been developed.
Yes, thank you. I go on to the next question, actually. There's a question by Jakob S. I think it might be Jakob Scherko, Jake Scherko, a good friend of CeBIL. He asked a question for either Tira or Terkel. What is the largest by population orphan indication in the EU for which there are 0 treatments? Do you think this is a science issue? For example, the target is undruggable, or an incentive one? Incentives are not high enough relative to the R&D. Could you give us any view on that?
Yeah, I'll defer to Terkel on the first part of the question, because I don't have an answer to that. So I don't know if he has that insight.
Well, I haven't looked into exactly which diagnoses would be candidates for that top list. Until a few months ago, I would have said disease like Angelman syndrome, but I know that there is now an orphan drug designation which has come to answer that disease. It is probably true that some of the diseases where you have a intellectual impairment have not really been prioritized in developing therapies. So I think we would look at some of those diseases. There are quite many.
Yeah, what I can add to that is I do think that the state of science definitely will play a part in that, because if we don't even know what is causing a disease, how can we begin developing a drug against it? So the incentives there may actually be needed all the way at the level of fairly fundamental research to encourage research in those areas. I think, and this is a bit more speculative, but patient advocacy is actually quite important in driving research as well. And some disease areas have much more vocal patient advocacy groups than others. So I think if you have a disease that is relatively rare or somehow just doesn't generate the public attention that you can get for ALS, Duchenne, or anything like that, that will have an influence.
Yes, thank you. And I think that also raises some ethical issues, probably, and inclusiveness issues, and so on. So this is an interesting remark. We have another, I think, interesting question here. A very good question from our colleague Jonathan Darrow from Harvard Medical School. He asked, the health policy literature often refers to lack of treatments or no treatments for many orphan diseases. Beyond the placebo effect, however, there is little difference between no treatment and a treatment that does very little to help the patient. For example, Alzheimer meds, multiple sclerosis meds, and so on. It would be great to hear the speaker's thoughts on how to focus regulators and industry on cures rather than low-value treatments that keep the healthcare system churning and generate profits, but leave patients with substantial unmet need. So what is your thought on that? Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to note that all rare diseases have unmet needs, and that goes even for those which are most common and where there is already a medical setup and specialized centers. There are very few diseases where you actually do have a cure at this point. There are a few coming, and we will see many more in the next decade, I think. However, the rare diseases where there is absolutely no therapy are many, as I demonstrated in my presentation. And I think that if we get together as stakeholders and look into the whole realm of rare diseases, we can rather easily identify the areas where we should really invest most and give more incentives. So for that reason, I'm in favor of a graduated system and a system where we can actually, with more knowledge, actually pinpoint where to invest.
Oh, Timo, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you so much. Any further comments on that? Because otherwise I try to get as many questions.
I can add a little bit. I mean, in a way, the regulatory framework does take that into account already, particularly for areas where there are treatments on the market. Might just need to demonstrate significant benefit. Significant benefit does take into account, like, is this really going to make any difference compared to what we already have? I also know that in the deliberations that are currently ongoing within the Commission to define unmet medical need, this is one of those areas that will definitely feature in there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think I now go to the next question because it also has some elements, I think, two questions actually that are interesting for you, Jakob, as well. So the first part of the question by Mark Stuhldreyer is, the Orphan Regulation seems to provide incentives mainly for the development of medicines for rare diseases affecting European populations. Is there data on whether the Orphan Regulation led to an increase in research investments in the field of neglected tropical diseases by European investors? So that is the first part of the question. The second question is, are there indicators suggesting that orphan protection for repositioned drug is misused by the industry to prolong protection periods? In particular, are there indicators that may suggest that the use of a drug for a particular rare disease is postponed to receive additional market exclusivity protection in the future? So if Terkel or Tira would take the first question and maybe Jakob would answer the second. Thank you.
Tira, would you start?
Sure. I'm not aware of any specific data that looks into the impact on neglected tropical diseases, but I have looked extensively at the portfolio of products in there, and I would be very, very surprised if there is any noticeable impact in the field of neglected tropical diseases. In general, the incentives that are used to drive R&D in that area are quite different. And you see a lot more of that going through, for instance, support for what they call product development partnerships.
Thank you. And Terkel, unless you have something to add, maybe Jakob could have a say on the second question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Jakob?
Yeah.
You're muted. Yeah.
So the second question, yeah, well, there's any indicators of misuse. Well, the issue of misuse, it's difficult because you can say, well, all the drugs that have received a designation from the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products, then the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products, they have assessed that this drug either meets an unmet need or has demonstrated significant benefit over an existing treatment. So then after that, saying that they have misused the system, then we end up in a kind of classical, well, the company will say, well, we are just following the rules. And then you can, of course, argue, well, discuss whether the rules are good or bad, but they have followed the rules. So that's why I pointed out that it's the expert assessment of the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products that sits with this kind of, this conundrum, this Gordian knot of getting this balance right. There was a recent, a couple of years ago, a case with Shire Pharmaceuticals, where the Court of Justice of the EU, they declined on making any assessment on the kind of the scientific assessment, and made this kind of a division of power judgment, saying, okay, we cannot rule on the scientific assessments, that up to the comp to do that. We can rule on law and whether the EMA there has made the right assessment of whether it was the same company, the same active ingredient, the formal things that they assessed. But the Court of Justice cannot make any judgments on the scientific part. That's the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products. So whether there's misuse, that will be a question of discussion, whether you consider something to be misuse.
Thank you, Jacob. And then there is one last question before we have our comfort break. And that question comes from Jin Ding. He says, thanks, or she, I'm not sure, says, thanks, Tira, Terkel, and Jacob. Great talk. I'm a research fellow from the University of Sheffield. I found there is a big gap of approved orphan drugs between the US and the EU. The number of approved orphan drugs is only about half of the number in the US. Tira, what's the reason from the regulator point of view? Terkel, what's your opinion about the availability as a director of the patients' organization?
Part of that is very administrative. It's the system in the US is very different in what it awards the status of an orphan medicine to. So part of that, they have a different prevalence threshold. They have different criteria for, they don't have an equivalent of this significant benefit that you need to demonstrate. So in many ways, the criteria for orphan designation in the EU are stricter than they are in the US. So that will account for part of the issue. There may be further issues in the regulatory system, also in the attractiveness of the market that have an influence. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to definitions.
Yes.
And I agree. It's more complex than that. But of course, what we would like to see is that the EU actually, or the European countries, can actually provide a more supportive framework for not only developing new therapies, but actually also to make sure that when products are developed, that we can also post-marketing collect data which can either prove or not demonstrate the benefit that was claimed for the product. And I think that in Europe we actually do have the possibility to do better in some ways, since we are now developing this reference network of specialized centers where we can now start collecting data in a much more systematic way. So I'm quite hopeful that Europe will be actually able to do things which will demonstrate real value for patients in that respect.
Thank you very much. Good word to conclude our first session and enter the comfort break. So many thanks to the speakers for really, really exciting, great presentation. Once again, sorry for cutting you off sometimes, but I think this was amazing. Thank you so much. And now we all will have a little comfort break and we gather again at 3:15 UK time. So 50 minutes. Thank you very much. See you then. Bye.
Well, thank you all for tuning back in for session 2 and our panel discussion. During this session, we'll have an opportunity to pick up on several of the issues raised in the first session and to broaden out the discussion depending on your interests. To facilitate all of this, I've been joined by three very expert people with a very wide set of backgrounds and perspectives. I'm going to begin by asking them a couple of questions to get the discussion rolling, and then I'll pose questions that the audience have listed in preferably the Q&A function, but we'll also keep an eye on the chat function. So now it's time to introduce our panelists, starting with Sarah Rickwood. Sarah has nearly 30 years of experience as a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, having worked with Accenture and IQVIA. She is now the Vice President of European Marketing and Thought Leadership in IQVIA, a team she's run for 10 years. IQVIA, as many of you will know, is a data-driven consulting group that provides analysis to its clients so they can make more evidence-based decisions and ultimately improve patient outcomes. Our second panelist is Sven Boston. Sven is Associate Professor of Biomedical Innovation Law at the University of Copenhagen and a core member of the CeBIL collaboration and the CeBIL Center in Copenhagen. He has wide knowledge of intellectual property law, particularly for life sciences, for instance, including patent law and regulatory exclusivities. He's been involved in important policy reports evaluating orphan drug regulation. Also joining our panel is Geraldine O'Day. Geraldine has a background in public health medicine and has worked as a medical assessor at the Irish Health Products Regulatory Authority since 2010. Significantly for our panel, she has been the Irish member of the European Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, which is commonly known as COMP, since 2011. Right then, so Sarah, I'd like to start with a question to you, if I may. What light can you shed on the companies in the orphan drug innovation space and the trends that we might have seen in this field?
Okay, well, I think it has changed over the last decade because we have to remember that if we were to go back to 2010, so a decade after the European orphan drug legislation was adopted, it was still the case that orphan approvals were generally pretty rare. And by 2020, we had a situation where in Europe, I think 59% of EMA approvals were for orphan medicines, and in the US, the picture was similar. So this is an area where we're seeing a huge amount of innovation come into the market, be approved, be made available for patients. The companies behind those used in the 2010s to typically be much smaller startup types of companies that may in many cases have been launching their first product. Over this last decade, orphan medicines have become much more interesting to mid-size and to the largest pharmaceutical companies. Shire was mentioned in the last session, but of course we see some of the very largest pharmaceutical companies in the world like Novartis and Sanofi investing in orphan medicines, having parts of their business that work with that, either innovation that they themselves have developed or in some cases innovation that they have during the course of development acquired the company that was originally behind. So it's very diverse now, and I expect that at some point in the next decade is going to be joined by companies that are actually producing biosimilars of certain orphan medicines as well. Because of course there are quite a few orphan medicines that will lose patent protection in the coming years. And the question is, will those be attractive targets for companies that want to produce lower cost alternatives?
I see. Okay, so we all know that drug companies sell their products globally, and that notably in the US, and that the returns in the US are often much higher than in other places, including Europe. So if I may ask, to what extent is EU regulation important for orphan drug innovation, or is this really a sideshow?
I think it's extremely important. As was mentioned in the previous panel, the fact of the matter is there is no global market as such for orphan medicines, because how rare diseases are defined is dependent upon the regulatory geography. It's generally pegged to the population that that regulator covers. And what an orphan medicine is different between the US and Europe. And the point was made that the European regulation is actually stricter in terms of defining orphan medicine status than the US is. So that doesn't mean that there isn't a significant overlap in terms of orphan medicines in both the US and Europe. There is, but this is not as such a global market. Europe is anyway at present the second most important market for the launch of innovation for the global prescription medicine industry after the US. Generally non-orphan, this is the decade where that may see some reset, because now China, which has been since 2013 the world's second largest prescription medicine market by value, is now also extremely important as an innovative prescription medicine market value, something the Chinese government seeks to encourage through development of their own innovative companies, as well as approving Western innovation. Outside of the US and Europe, orphan medicine legislation has been adopted much later, or in some cases not at all. It will be interesting to see what happens in China in that respect.
Right, okay, that's fascinating. Now, if you members of the audience have more questions you'd like to know about the commercial landscape, please do post your questions. We can come back to this topic. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to return to the issue of indication stacking that generated quite a lot of discussion from our speakers in the first session. So, Sven, if I may turn to you, Jacob Vestal argued that perhaps the problem is not as serious as many people think. In your opinion, is this a big enough issue to be putting a lot of effort into for policy reform?
Thank you very much for your question. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to openly disagree with my colleague, and maybe he doesn't even mean himself whether it's, well, I'm not sure actually whether he meant it was not that important. I mean, obviously, with small numbers, it's always difficult, of course, to make enormous judgments. We have in total, I mean, if we look at the report, the work document by the European Commission, I look at those numbers, because obviously it's a bit outdated now, but if I look at those numbers, we talk about 131 in total authorized orphan drugs, and of these we have 22 with indication stack, so stacking indications. So 20. So that's for me a statistically relevant issue. The thing is a bit that because all the things are overlapping and are interacting with each other, there might actually be a reason why people say it's maybe not that relevant because there's not a lot of cases or something we have. Problem with that is, of course, that there's always this patent protection that is there. And in most cases, patent protection outdates or outlives the orphan drug designation, even though with indication stacking, it can be different. I mean, there is one example, I believe it's called Revlimid. It had 5 different indications with a total period of more than 20 years in total. So with all the additions. So I do think it's probably more important, that which I absolutely do not mean to say that Jakob has said it's not important, but I do think it's statistically relevant, and I'm actually a bit slightly concerned because one thing that the Commission said in its working document concerned me a bit, because they said, okay, first of all, it's a low number. I don't necessarily agree it's a very low number. They say it's a low number. Well, it's low, but it's about 18%, which I don't consider to be very low. Secondly, they say, well, we are not sure it's really a big problem because each indication, that term of 10 years stops, and then there is the new indication that starts. So you have like a clear cut off date Unfortunately, in real life, that's not how it works. Indeed, I'm not going to dispute that there is a cutoff date, but if the one indication is no longer under exclusivity, there can be cross-label prescription on a drug that is still under exclusivity. And that means you end up in trouble because as a generic, if there would be generic competition, you would then produce drugs which are no longer exclusivity, but they would be cross-label prescribed by doctors for something that is still under exclusivity. And then, of course, you would still have an infringement issue. So, and that's something we know from patent law where the same thing happens. So I'm slightly concerned that we might, of course, end up in a situation where this is becoming more common. Of course, and definitely in personalized medicine, this is likely going to become a bigger problem.
Okay. Okay, well, we're building up a picture here that the issues are quite a bit more complicated than they seem at first, both for the issue of whether things are overcompensated and the legal questions that are stored up. Geraldine, if I may turn to you now then and ask if you could shed a bit more light on how the comp deals with this policy issue of indication stacking. We've heard, and it comes as no surprise, that the comp is alert to the issue. I think one of our speakers mentioned that there was specific guidance that the comp had published, but perhaps you could tell us a bit about how the deliberations go in comp, what we don't get to see.
With regard to indication stacking, that's probably, it's something we're aware of. We don't necessarily like it, but because these are separate indications, these are separate conditions and recognized to be so, there's really not a lot we can actually do about it because we will take each application on its merits. I mean, I think the idea, the concept of indication stacking and salami slicing are different. And we have a much, for me, indication stacking might be, okay, let's say X drug starts off with an indication for acute myeloid leukemia. But there are other sort of trials in the pipeline dealing with other blood cancer indications. So then there will be a subsequent application for orphan designation for each one of those. And that's what I see as indication stacking. You're using the same product to treat a number of different, say, blood cancers, for instance. So that's what indication stacking means to me. And actually, what's interesting is that as part of the, I always forget the correct terminology for these commission things. The implementation something. A roadmap, whatever, you know, basically the kind of road testing that the Commission is doing and the consultancy that's working for the moment is doing. There was a questionnaire which was circulated. I mean, it was open to anybody really with an interest to respond, but it was sent to, you know, departments of health in each country and like regulatory authorities like the HPRA. But one of the suggestions within the questionnaire is actually to have a cumulative prevalence for conditions where you could have indication stacking.
And how would that work? What can you explain to those of us unfamiliar what that would mean?
Say I don't know what the prevalence of acute myeloid leukemia is. Let's say it's, I don't know, 2 in 10,000. Okay, so then you look for an indication in I don't know, mantle cell leukemia. Okay, so the prevalence there is 1 in 10,000. So it would come up, and by the time you hit 5 in 10,000, you would be above the prevalence threshold. So the rest of the stacks could not be included.
I see.
The rest of the coins in the stack, you know, you would not be considered for an orphan designation. It's just one of the options that was in this questionnaire. There was a whole range of things that you could actually, you know, give your views on. But the area about for the salami slicing, I think that for us is very concerning because you don't want to turn subsets of common diseases into rare diseases. Because, I mean, if we were to accept that, you kind of distract away attention from the truly rare diseases, and the subsets of the common disease might meet the rare threshold, but they're fairly common rare conditions, if you know what I mean. So how it tends to be approached is you can subset, as we call it, in a subset of a common condition, but the treatment, obviously that subset will have to have prevalence below 5 in 10,000, but also the product you're developing. Sorry, there is some legalese around this, but this is how I interpret it. Being a completely non-legal person, basically that product should not work in any other members of the population with the condition outside of the subset. And that is the only situation in which the subset would be accepted. And I suppose we work quite, I need to clarify here, I'm speaking really on my own behalf as a member of the COMP rather than on behalf of the COMP or my organization. So these are my own views. So I suppose we would be quite rigorous in how we approach that.
And is it, do you get a recommendation, or
Yes.
which you then deliberate as a wider group?
Well, we do. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it might be helpful if I explained our process. There are two parts to the orphan designation. There is an initial designation, usually early in the product development stage, and there is later confirmation of the designation at the time of marketing authorization. And basically, a company or SME, whatever academic group, it could be anybody, will submit an application to the orphan's office, which is then validated. They have the option then to come for a pre-submission meeting, where people will advise them a bit on, where members of staff in the orphan's office will advise them a bit on their application. So once the application is validated, and also I should mention, there's a standardized application form that tends to set out the information they must submit in terms of what the criteria are for orphan designation. So it's quite logical. So basically, the application is assessed by a member of the COMP and a scientific officer from the EMA. So you have a sort of a dual rapporteurship. And then following that, it's discussed at a meeting of the COMP. So if it's decided at the discussion, and usually the rapporteurs will have a strong view on whether actually this is fine, all the criteria met, tick, great. Or there are some things we have uncertainties about. And then if there are uncertainties, you bring them back for an oral explanation where it's discussed again quite, the applicant addresses the issues, and then there's further questions and it's discussed again within. So there's quite a lot of deliberation, really.
Okay.
Especially, there's a lot of deliberation.
That's good to know. And I mean,
where things are uncertain, where it's clear cut, there's no need for it. So yeah, so it's focused in on where there are difficulties and uncertainties. And sometimes it is clear that this application won't meet the designation criteria, but you still have to go through those steps to give people a chance to make their case and bring any evidence that they might not have when they made their initial submission.
And I mean, organizationally, that sounds quite clear and sensible. Does it follow the pattern often attributed to European regulatory decisions where decided by consensus? Ultimately,
generally,
that there's a discussion and it leads the group to a common view, which then becomes the decision.
Yes, but it doesn't always happen like that.
Okay. Yes.
We do vote, and I think that's a testament to the fact that it is actually quite difficult sometimes to arrive at a decision, and there will be different perceptions. You know, it's not black and white, cut and dried at all.
Okay.
Sometimes it's very clear, and sometimes it's not.
Like a lot of judgment.
That's actually,
yes.
it's an evaluation, it's a judgment.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that we had a question early in session 1 earlier about how COMP makes decisions or judgments about whether there's significant clinical benefit. And one of the audience members directed people to a paper where they had done some research looking at the decisions that had been made. But from the point of view of a member of COMP, do you feel like that there is a rule of thumb for deciding whether something meets a significant clinical need, or are you aware of that paper? Do you have reflections on it?
I think some of those papers have come out of COMP. They've been written, you know, but it's basically, I think what COMP does, which is quite useful, is I think we try to improve our processes and our decision making, because the science is evolving as well. So we kind of need to keep on top of that. And I suppose that perhaps also maybe we're stricter than we would have been in the early years of the orphan legislation. Some of that is about, you know, gaining in experience. With regard to significant benefit, there's actually, it's defined as a clinically significant advantage or a major contribution to patient care. So we don't really think of it as unmet medical need, and that often comes up, and it's a concept that sponsors or applicants will raise with us, but it's actually not something that's enshrined in the legislation or something. I mean, obviously we do think about it, but not necessarily as that concept. But getting back to the significant benefit, so basically a clinically relevant advantage, and I must stress as well that the threshold for getting over the significant benefit hurdle is much lower at the time of designation than it is at the time of marketing authorization. Because when you're at designation, really mostly what people have is some, at the most, early clinical data or preclinical data in vivo data in animal models. So the clinically relevant advantage basically means you've got greater efficacy than the existing products. And you could show this in animal models compared to the existing products. Or your product will work in a subset of patients where there is a treatment. Now, these are just some examples where there is a treatment, but but it's not particularly useful in that subset. You're sort of meeting an unmet need. Gosh, I'm using that phrase again.
And well, that was also a point made earlier today.
In a larger group of people with a rare disease, that, you know, there may be treatments which only work in certain genetic mutations. Mm-hmm. But the designation is given for the wider condition, or in theory, like the indicate, you know, they are covered by this. But so it's that's. No, you can also try.
Well, I think
on the basis of better safety, but that can be very difficult to demonstrate, just given the small numbers. And for the major contribution to patient care, that's usually an improvement in quality of life. But you need data. You need data for all of this. We're not going to make too many. Okay, sometimes with preclinical data, we make some assumptions, but we try to limit them as much as possible. But if you are,
if I could perhaps hear a general point in what you're saying, is you have these legal phrases that apply a minimum threshold that, and it can be met in different ways, but the rule is not set up so that it finds the most, or directs people to the highest priority, directs researchers to the highest priority. And perhaps that's not the role of COMP, to be stringently monitoring that. But perhaps there would be some tools or rules that might help COMP with its decision making. And I wonder if we could perhaps think a little bit more about some of the policies that have been suggested and that might work, and get reflections from the panel. So if I may ask Sven, what sort of rule are you most interested in for trying to address this salami slicing and indication stacking? Oh, you're on mute, Sven.
Yeah, I know. I was telling myself I had to unmute myself. So, well, obviously, because the two things are actually separate, even though they might overlap. So, the indication stacking There's a number of ways how you can deal with that. Well, one of them is do nothing, obviously. Another one could potentially be that you say, as people might know, of course, in the traditional system, there is only one exclusivity period, and then if you then, for example, have a new indication, you don't get a separate period. This is what in Europe we call the global marketing authorization concept. You could say, well, you had it once, you can't accumulate the various periods. Obviously, the argument against that is you say you disincentivize people to come up with new indications. So in order to accommodate partly that argument, you can say, well, maybe we give something additional, but it's not going to be another 10 years because, of course, a lot of the investment has been made. So do you really need another 10 years because you work with the same product with a new indication? You just go for a new, you go for a new indication. So maybe you could think about a shorter period of time. For example, you reduce that period of 10 to, for example, a period of 5 or a period of 4. Because actually what we have seen, and unless I have misinterpreted some of the writing in the Commission report, that the average period of exclusivity that is being used is not 10 years under the orphan drug system. It's less. I thought it was 3.6 years or something. So it doesn't seem to be the case that the 10 years is actually used that much. So you could actually argue, well, if you already had 10 years for your, let's say, your original, your master file, if I can call it that way, then for a subsequent indication, you would have a period of 3 or 4 years. So that could be an alternative. Salami slicing, I think, is slightly more complicated because obviously salami slicing is based on scientific evaluation. So you have, it's not that you have invented disease, it is a disease, it's just that personalized medicine brings with it that you dig deeper in a genome. And if you dig deep enough, you always find a gene. And obviously, if you dig deep enough, you find a gene that very few people have a mutation of. So to be honest, at this stage, I don't have necessarily a solution for salami slicing, how you have to do that, because it would have to be based on some kind of scientific assessment that you have to cut off at some point, say, you know what, maybe it is indeed. I think what Geraldine said, I find quite interesting, because she was suggesting maybe if you have a subset, you claim, but if by treating that subset, you would actually include also the bigger set, then you would not be able to do it. So basically, if there would be some inherent availability already in the bigger set, then you would not get a new indication for the subset, which includes part of the bigger set. That I think
I'm glad you brought that up, Sven, because we actually did have a question from a member of the audience about that policy on accumulated prevalence. The question is, how would that operate? How would that sit with follow-on indications? Would there be complexity there?
Well, here, of course, we are again in the process of going to the two things at the same time. So the salami slicing and the indication stacking, they don't have to go together, but they can go together. So don't make a mistake about it. They do sometimes go together. Well, to be honest, it's a fantastic question, and I wish I knew the answer. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, because there is, I think you have to make it clear, be it in the guidance that for applicants, that of course there are certain consequences, and there is at some point some kind of, because actually you can calculate yourself the prevalence, and if there is some kind of accumulative prevalence, that at some point you've eaten up your options. Obviously, there is a risk there, I have to confess, that there could be some waste in investment, of course, because people might be already, because it's not like you wait until you have eaten up your accumulative prevalence, and then you're going to start investing in further indications. So you might end up that you've eaten up your accumulative prevalence, and then end up in having to waste your investment because you can no longer get a new designation. So I do predict that maybe people from industry have more inside knowledge of that. There is a risk, of course, that you might disincentivize people, because they might say, well, you know what, if I start this process and at some point I eat up my accumulative prevalence, I must still be interested in starting the whole process, because at some point it might all end.
Right. So that this is all directed at the problem of possible overprotection by granting people exclusivities in the market. Overprotection through exclusivity is itself driven by the prices that are paid for that exclusivity. So, Sarah, I don't know if this is within your area of competence, but please adjust it to suit. What sorts of reimbursement mechanisms are working well or not so well for orphan drugs and their pricing? Is that something that you've looked into comparatively for clients or through your own interests?
I suppose if I start from the broader perspective, I think a good question is what share of the total prescription medicine spend in Europe is taken up by orphan medicines. Because if you look at individual costs of things and you go, oh my God, that gene therapy is €1 million or something. But there are 1,000 patients in Europe. Yes, it is individually expensive, but in terms of what in the end healthcare systems have to pay for collectively, this is a small part of the medicines bill. The answer, the number that we have estimated is that about 6% of total prescription medicine spend in Europe goes to orphan medicines. Now, I think other estimates have said that the European population that suffers from a rare disease is between 6 to 8% of the population. That's not a good equivalence because not all of that 6 to 8% of people who suffer from a rare disease suffer from a rare disease which actually has a medicine to treat it. In fact, it's a minority of the diseases that have a medicine to treat it now, which is one reason why we actually need to continue to incentivize innovation. Even if we've seen this significant increase in the number of approvals, the fact of the matter remains, most rare diseases do not have prescription medicine treatments available for them at the moment. I know that's not the answer to your question. In terms of individual market access agreements, I think orphan medicines has probably been one of the areas that has pioneered some of the more cutting edge arrangements for market access because of the nature of the products that we're increasingly seeing. We're seeing gene therapies which promise for a long-term treatment for a patient, possibly a curative treatment, although of course we can't say that for any gene therapy yet because they are so new. The very real question of upfront payment for that gene therapy versus evaluation of that patient's progress over time. And if they're a child, of course, that may be the entirety, most of their life that you have to evaluate. And that is one that is being worked out right now. You know, those programs are underway for products like Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy in that area. So I think there's always this tension in the orphan medicine space between the question of pricing for individual products, which do have to reflect the fact that even if a product is treating only 1,000 patients, nevertheless, clinical trials are extremely expensive. And if we talk about cell therapies particularly, the cost of goods for that treatment is also extremely expensive and in no way comparable to the cost of a tablet of aspirin or something like that. You know, we're talking about treatments that require for delivery hundreds of people within a hospital to be trained in their part in the process in delivering that therapy, for example, which isn't the cost of the drug, but it certainly is cost to healthcare systems. So we need to, I think, always look at the challenge in both ways. It's the challenge of the cost of the individual medicine, which can be very high, but it's also the question of how much do rare orphan medicines cost as a share of the entirety of healthcare spend. And it is still a relatively small percentage in the final analysis.
Right, okay. It gets complicated from an economic point of view when we look at the head per the population head that are covered by that expense, though. But you pointed to that tension very well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
yes.
the other thing, just to point out, is that The orphan medicine legislation in Europe has been in place since 1999. As I said, in the first decade, we saw very few orphan medicine approvals, and then they started to tick up significantly, which I think, you know, it's an expression of success. This legislation was designed to incentivize research, and incentivize research it did. Now, 2020s, we are entering a phase where those early orphan medicines, in many cases, are actually moving off patent, not simply losing market exclusivity, they are moving off patent. And the question is then, will generic versions and biosimilar versions of those medicines come? About 11% of orphan biologics have a biosimilar development at the moment, which suggests to me that there needs to be some work incentivizing the development of these biosimilars, because it's a very different proposition to developing a biosimilar for, say, insulin against insulin, or for rheumatoid arthritis, or any of the much larger indications. But the fact of the matter is the orphan market is not static, it's evolved, and it's evolving to a situation where the possibility of lower cost alternatives for some orphan medicines in use is possible. And the question should be asked, is that being encouraged as much as it should be?
Right, okay. And just to compare, you made some fascinating points about biosimilars in the rare disease market. Is it different for small molecule generics in the rare disease market, or is that also, does it also tend to be a bit slower for generics to enter orphan drug?
That's the question of cost and development. So if a company wants to develop a generic of a small molecule product, the industry wisdom about the costs to do that would be a few million euros, certainly less than 10 million euros to do so, in terms of the submissions that they need to make and so on and so forth to get approval for their generic product. For a biosimilar that is not an orphan biosimilar, but a biosimilar going into the areas of RA, oncology, erythropoietins, and so on and so forth, the industry estimates are in the region of $100 million to develop these products, because they have to run clinical trials. Now, that's not going to be the case for an orphan medicine, because you're talking about much smaller populations. But, you know, it's going to be half to 40% maybe. So you're still talking about $40 million to bring the biosimilar into the market, get approval for it. And then you have to ask, well, what is the return going to be for that biosimilar version of the orphan medicine once it is there? Yes, there are some significant products that sell hundreds of millions of euros or dollars in orphan medicines, but that's not actually most orphan medicines. There's about 5 at any one time that are really significant sales, and the majority have much lower sales, lower than 100 million euros a year. So you have to get the balance between the investments that you want companies making lower cost copies of these products to make, and the return that they might possibly get when they enter into the market.
Okay. While we're on this topic of reimbursements, we did have a question, and I think it might be best directed to Sven. And the question is, rather than reorganize sort of, institutions and systems for controlling prices of drugs, why not just use existing legal instruments such as competition law to control excess pricing? Because otherwise the system seems to have, you know, incrementally evolved satisfactory to the tailoring that national countries want to see. So can you shed some light for the audience who might have joined us from many jurisdictions as to whether competition law in Europe is a satisfactory control mechanism for drug prices?
Okay, well, it's a good question, and it's obviously never or I think. so antitrust law is always applicable. So it's always applicable. Whatever regulatory framework you have, it's always there. But it's not necessarily the most efficient and the most productive tool, I have to say. And that is because it's relatively slow. It depends also on the national regulator, of course, the national authority. Enforcement is national of European competition law predominantly, which means, of course, and we know, for example, when it comes to excessive pricing in general, I'm not talking about excessive pricing of orphan drugs in particular, but if we talk about excessive pricing in general, there is quite a discrepancy within the national regulator or regulators or enforcers, competition law enforcers, as to how they look into the issue of excessive pricing in case there is some form of exclusivity on the product. For example, what about alleged excessive pricing in case there's still patent protection on your product, which of course is a similar situation in which you have a market exclusivity period for an orphan drug. The member states do not agree on that. Competition law authorities do not agree on that within the European Union. And actually the example was given of the Netherlands because that's one of the enforcers that seems to be a bit more keen on going that way. I don't have a problem with the application of competition law in general. I actually do not think it provides an enormous amount of legal certainty because of the very slow process and the discrepancy you have within member states. That's why I think I would prefer some kind of regulatory solution at the EU level, because then at least you create a level playing field amongst all players within the EU. And because it doesn't work extremely effectively and extremely quickly, I have to say, because of course, what is an excessive price? We have standards for that in European case law, as such they exist, but everything becomes more complicated because we don't actually have European case law on the issue of excessive pricing in the context of patent protected products or exclusivity protected products. We have occasionally, I think that actually probably the Dutch and the Italian authorities are probably the most willing to conclude for excessive pricing quicker than others. And that's no negative comment whatsoever. It's just that they seem to be a bit more willing to quicker decide on an excessive pricing situation, even in a case where there is still exclusive rights on it. But it's a long process. Don't make a mistake. I mean, every decision can be appealed, and then you go to an appeal, and then you go in further appeal, and then it ends up at the European Court of Justice, inevitably, because someone has to give an interpretation. So yeah, it can easily take many years, and I'm a bit worried about legal certainty if that would become like the mainstream tool.
Right. Okay. So there's some deficiency of the kind of ex post fact mopping up of the issues as compared to the ex ante. You both have their positives and negatives, and it's very hard to get a comparative cost benefit, reliable cost benefit equation. That's very helpful. I don't think any symposium or conference is complete without considering whether the COVID pandemic has made any big waves in this field. So we'll come back to some of the policy options that we might take forward, but let's just hear from Sarah. Has the pandemic changed the nature of this space at all? And is that likely to be long lasting?
I think that we are still looking at the way the consequences are going to be playing out as far as the launch of innovation is concerned, because of course developing and launching innovation for the pharmaceutical industry is a 10 to 15 year process. So I'm pretty certain that even in 2030, I'm still going to be talking about the pandemic's impacts on innovation in one way or another, because there was a very tangible, immediate impact for clinical development. IQVIA is also a clinical development organization. When during lockdowns, of course, patients could not go into hospitals or be visited or visit their clinical trial sites for a period of time. That, of course, has recovered now, but that will potentially have impacts for products that could be launched in maybe 2025 or even later. We can, of course, see the very tangible effects as far as the products that were launched by pharmaceutical companies, non-COVID products, I mean, during 2020. The first thing I'd say is from an approvals perspective, from the EMA and the FDA, the products were approved at the same rate or better than they had been historically. So approvals were not held up during 2020. And as I've already said, more than half of those approvals were orphan medicine approvals last year. And the products also came into markets. We didn't see pharmaceutical companies delay their launches because of the pandemic. They brought them into markets almost in all cases at the rates that we'd seen historically. What from a commercial perspective is challenging is that if I take the non-orphan medicines that were launched, because of course there's very important cancer treatments, for migraine, treatments in heart disease and other areas that were being launched during 2020. The issue is that what lockdowns did is they prevented patients from seeing doctors face to face to a large degree. And doctors almost universally report that they do not feel comfortable diagnosing and prescribing new treatments if they do not see patients face to face. And that's scarcely surprising. So no patient visits, fewer opportunities to diagnose patients with a condition, fewer opportunities to actually prescribe new treatments for a period of time. Now, there are exceptions. There are some circumstances under which if a doctor already knows a patient and they're prescribing something new to an existing patient, they're happy to prescribe remotely. And of course, face-to-face visits are coming back, but that was a challenge for launch products. Interestingly, from a commercial perspective, orphan medicines were much more resilient. Commercially, they tended to continue to see sales that were as expected, or in some cases stronger than expected during 2020. And be clear, I'm talking about non-COVID products, because COVID vaccines and treatments followed their own dynamic during the pandemic, fairly obviously. I think the reason for this is because in the rare disease area, where you have a very small number of patients, often with extremely significant unmet needs, the companies developing these products are working closely with the patient groups, the doctors and the patients for a lengthy period in the development of the product. And so there are a group of patients who are waiting to be treated with the product once it is approved and made available. And even during the pandemic, because the patients were known, healthcare systems worked to get those products to those patients, because of course there was a very high unmet need. So the system continued to work. I think the challenge is going to be for the products that are in development and were close to the market in 2020 and 2021 onwards, because then the challenge of the dysfunctional healthcare system and the significant levels of remote care start to kick in. You know, we know, anybody who works with patients with rare diseases know that one of the challenges for these patients is getting diagnosed, particularly if they're adults with a rare condition. Because they get passed between doctors and doctors and doctors who, you know, often do not see more than one or two of these patients ever in the course of their career. And you can well understand that in a situation where the healthcare system anyway is having difficulty seeing patients, it's going to be magnified for the rare disease. So that's why I say we will probably continue to have to monitor this, because I think the impacts are still going to be felt for many years to come. Okay,
well, that's fascinating on two levels. It's another way in which COVID has affected our society, but it also points to there not being clear causes for the shortcomings of the system. Like it could be that it's, you know, at a level of patient diagnosis, not to mention basic research or translation or cost. It's not clear that that the problem should be laid at the feet of the exclusivity period, although as legal researchers, we tend to focus there. Very interesting. I'd like to, well, actually, before I swing back to that, while we're on the topic of themes that come up at every meeting, regardless of academic discipline or industry sector, what do you think the effects of Brexit might be, Sarah, if any?
Well, it means we've got our own regulator, doesn't it? And that regulator, of course, can choose to mirror EMA regulation or choose to follow another path and perhaps be maybe more innovative in certain areas, or perhaps more closely mirror the FDA than the EMA in this respect. That is still a work in progress. I can't comment on the specifics of that, but in the end, that is the possibility when we have our own regulator and are following our own path in that respect.
Right. I suppose, though, we'd face the issue that for what are already rare diseases in Europe, we would be an exceedingly small market in England to be having our own regulatory system. But that's something where further research in the kind of US European comparison would have interesting policy relevance. So now I would like to swing back to some of the recommendations that have been mentioned in policy documents and also by Tyra and Turkel in session 1. One of them that I found very interesting, but it wasn't unpacked in any detail, was Turkel's suggestion that perhaps there should be more powers for comp. Geraldine, is there anything on the horizon that comp would like policymakers to send their way in terms of tools to help them do their job more effectively?
Sorry, I had a bit of instability in my connection just now, so is this question addressed to me? Yeah.
Yes. Turkel, I see you're still online, and if you wanted to elaborate on what you had in mind so Geraldine could respond specifically. But in your presentation, you said perhaps one direction might be to give comp more powers.
Yes, my idea, or the idea of Eurotis, is that comp could actually be involved all along the process and perhaps also support the development when it comes to pediatric drugs. For instance, you have a system where the committee for pediatric drugs can develop a kind of investigation plan for those drugs. So supporting the sponsor to actually do the kind of studies which will facilitate the way towards approval. So the idea is, if we could perhaps also with the comp have interventions like the elaboration of such plans, better discussions of where the unmet needs are, where special incentives could be relevant. Things like that would perhaps be interesting to consider with regard to the competences of comp in the future.
Okay. Well, Geraldine, what are your thoughts on that suggestion?
It sounds very interesting, and it sounds like it could be really useful. But I suppose COMP as is constituted, this is just my view, COMP as is constituted and the way it's resourced at the moment probably wouldn't be able to fulfill all of those roles. That would be my first point. And I suppose to a certain extent, some of what Terkel was talking about kind of exists at the moment in the sense that you do have the prime process, which generally tends to favor orphan products, though it seems to be quite hard to get a prime designation, which will help guide companies through the process and give advice on the most appropriate, trial design, etc., etc. And I suppose to an extent where there are existing products authorized for a condition at the moment, we as COMP provide scientific advice around significant benefit. I'm not sure about the whole, what you would require to be able to sort of give direction and guidance around prioritizing the most, I suppose, the areas of highest need for development. And I don't really know how that would work. And whether COMP necessarily are the body with the necessary skills to actually do that. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I think it's basically my answer is I don't really know. It's appealing, but I'm not sure how it would translate into practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just as a non-expert reflection from myself, I wonder if because COMP is not required to limit orphan designation and orphan authorizations to only the most beneficial products, they're perhaps less of a place where people would go to have those sorts of discussions. It might be that through industry associations, it would be useful to disseminate information about where patient organizations think there's the biggest unmet clinical need. Though COMP, given their status, it might be beneficial if they were helpful in convening those discussions or participating or present or something like that. It does sound like more communication about unmet clinical needs would be useful, especially if we're going to get indicators and guidelines as to performance in that domain and differentiation of exclusivity periods depending on the extent to which the drug meets an unmet need. I think a lot of this requires quite a lot of data generation and dialogue about and a degree of overlapping consensus, at least, about what sorts of factors might point towards an important clinical need or significant as opposed to insignificant clinical benefit. Another policy suggestion was that there might be variable lengths of exclusivity. So somewhat controversially, that exclusivity might be less than 10 years, even though that is the settled expectation of pharmaceutical companies at present, and that it would be a spectrum. So I wonder if we might ask a few of our panelists about this to reflect from their particular area of expertise. So Geraldine, starting with you, do you think that COMP would have the capacity to make decisions about fitting developments along a spectrum as to those that are more or less deserving of a shorter or longer exclusivity period? Could you imagine COMP doing that?
Yes, because the Commission, as part of the pharmaceutical strategy, have been looking at definitions for unmet need. And I think it could sort of fit within that to an extent. And I suppose, as a non-legal person, I think that the incentives should be proportional to the amount of effort that goes into the development. So, for instance, Jakob described as repositioning. I suppose I think of it as repurposing, sort of where a drug is being repurposed, or where it's already, whether it hasn't been authorized, but it's commonly used, and then a marketing authorization is granted. I really think that the period of market exclusivity should be markedly reduced in that situation, because really the development costs are quite small compared to a de novo new drug.
Okay.
So I think, yes, and I think you could use whatever definition of unmet need comes up, and there has been quite a bit of consultation around it, unmet medical need. You could kind of use that as your framework for helping you to decide, perhaps.
Okay. So a very optimistic, positive response there. Sven, turning to you next, could you imagine legislation or policy setting vocabulary around this that would become a legally binding set of rules, and what might be the hidden complexities there?
Well, everything is possible, of course, but if we look at other areas of the law, which also work with a one-stop shop, where you have one period. I mean, I think there has been discussion about variable lengths of exclusivity as long as exclusive rights exist. So it's not a new idea. Obviously, if you look at another area of exclusive rights, such as patent law, there has been a lot of discussion there. Maybe we should have, for example, for software, much less protection, because it's a very incremental technology that requires far less investment. I've actually at some point myself suggested maybe to have a different exclusive right system for example, repurposed drugs, because currently under the patent system, you get your 20 years plus whatever you have. So I've myself maybe suggested that we should think about maybe something else. Didn't go very far. So the problem with that is obviously that there's a lot of parameters you have to take into account, and that is, of course, that a hugely complex subject has to be given to politicians that don't know. I mean, I'm not saying anything that is hopefully that is not appropriate, but are not necessarily mastering all the detail of what they have to do, and that obviously becomes a very complex, like potpourri mash, and God knows what comes out of that, because obviously it becomes a consequence of negotiations. Because we're in Europe, it's at the EU level. The people in the UK don't have to worry about that, but in Europe it becomes a negotiation, and European negotiations already terribly lengthy and not necessarily leading to a useful result at the end. Mm-hmm. And if you make it hugely complex, we can already see, of course, that how you determine what is more or less investment. I mean, this argument has been made for already quite often in repurposed drugs. Some people say, yeah, that can't have cost you a lot of money to apply that small molecule to a other disease. Well, is that true? Is that not true? I mean, it's very difficult to quantify that. Also, because we don't have access to the data. It's the pharmaceutical industry who have access to the data largely, and we don't have that. So we have to make value judgments based on incorrect or in at least incomplete data. So right. I don't have a principal view against it, because it might be useful, but the problem is I think we have been trying that in other rights as well, and it hasn't really worked. So we have stuck to like the one-stop shop because it was easiest, and it gave less legal uncertainty maybe.
And as a fellow patent lawyer, I mean, many countries have tried what they call petty patents, or utility patents with a shorter duration, and then abandon those ideas as people try and work around the system, try and squeeze under the more generous And then there's appeals about whether they fit in one or the other. And, and interestingly, something often overlooked is international economic treaties, where if companies do have fair and legitimate expectations that they be due for 10 years of orphan exclusivity and have been presently working towards that, we could only commence a new set of rules, you know, sometime in the future. It couldn't be retrospective, and it shouldn't really be too rapid, or those companies might have a private right of action against the countries that introduce it. Yeah. It's actually an area of international law often overlooked. But Sarah, I'd also like to hear your thoughts. What do you think the industry would think about a set of rules that tried to make exclusivity more proportionate to the meritorious developments or the more difficult developments?
Okay, well, I think that I have two questions, which, well, it's question back, which is, what problem are you trying to solve for by varying levels of exclusivity? Is it trying to reduce the costs of these medicines? Because if it is, exclusivity alone, reduction or otherwise, is not sufficient. At the end of the period of exclusivity, to reduce costs, you have to have competition. You have to have competing products so that a lower price can be achieved. If there is no generic or no biosimilar, then you do not have the competition that is going to lower prices anyway. And as I've noted previously, I think we are entering a different phase as far as orphan medicines is concerned, where the possibility for many of the orphan medicines that were launched in the 2010s to have generic competition becomes much greater, just because of the age that they are now. They've moved into that loss of exclusivity phase. Incidentally, Revlimid, which was talked about, there's generics available, according to media reports, of Revlimid in certain European countries, and have been since 2019. So that phase is happening, and the question is, how do we put in place a system that encourages the companies that either generic companies or biosimilar companies that would like to develop competitive low cost products in the orphan medicines area? How do you put in place a system that enables them to find it attractive? Because you cannot assume that the generic and biosimilars market, as it works for mainstream medicines, is going to work in this area. We are just talking about a industry, in the case of the generics industry, that traditionally has been a volume industry with extremely low margins, and it's been able to tolerate those low margins because it is a volume industry, moving into areas that by definition are not high volume.
Okay.
Low margin, and at the same time requiring, in the case of biosimilars, that expensive clinical trials be undertaken. If we then look, I suppose, forward to the future of orphan medicines,
yes, why don't we make that? Why don't we make that let's move to that. We've just got a few more minutes left, so let's take that as our final question for all of you panelists. Offer us a brief comment on what you think the future holds for orphan medicines. Sarah, please. So carry on your thought.
We will still see small molecule orphan medicine products, but a lot of the innovation is going to be in the area of gene therapies, RNAi therapies, and other silencing therapies, cell therapies, because in the end, many rare diseases do have a genetic origin, and this is the most appropriate set of technology platforms to address this. And then I think a question that will be increasingly important is, how could you produce it's not really a generic, but how can you produce a copy of a gene therapy?
Okay, so those are the challenges ahead of us.
Because we are talking about a very different kind of animal. If I were to do one thing to continue to encourage innovation in orphan medicines, it would be to put in place legislation that allows, mandates neonatal screening for genetic diseases on a much broader set of genetic diseases than are currently screened for, even ones potentially that do not currently have treatments, so that there is the ability to understand those patients in a much better way, to be able to actually encourage the development of treatments for them. Because in the end, treatments get developed because there is information that helps you understand the problem and potentially develop solutions.
Okay, well, I could see a whole nother symposium there on whole genome sequencing of neonates. But I see where you're coming from for the orphan drug development. Sven, and Turkel, I think we'll let you have the final word on that. But Sven, your thoughts on the future?
Well, I mean, I think a lot has already been said, I think, so I don't want to repeat myself. And I think Sarah said something very valuable. Of course, if the area evolves into something different, then obviously the instruments we have now and the remedies we try to find for something what happens now might not be extremely efficient, and maybe we have been wasting our time in trying to do that. I don't know. I'm obviously not a fortune teller, but I'm definitely believing that Sarah knows more about how the industry evolves than I do. So that's probably, of course, if you could basically circumvent genetic competition by the way that these things happen, and that's not by deliberate choice, but by, of course, the way these therapies work. I mean, there's in any event one thing I think that needs to be said about. On the one hand, I do think there are potential issues with genetic competition. And delay of it because of exclusive rights. On the other hand, I don't think we have to fool ourselves. I don't believe there's an awful lot of generic competition in orphan drugs for the reason that Sarah, amongst others, said, and that is, of course, that big volume is their natural habitat, and
right.
that's never going to be there. And if you talk about biosimilars, it's currently actually a business that is very much questioned by the people who are in this business, whether it's worthwhile continuing it, because the profit margins vis-a-vis the cost doesn't seem to be great. So,
which takes us back to the rarity.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Geraldine, then a final thought on the next, what you would like to see or what you expect to see over the next 5 to 10 years. You're on.
Sorry, I'm not a fortune teller either. I agree actually with what Sarah said, and I agree with her as well about the genetic screening, or a need to have some form to improve diagnostics in tandem with the development of new drugs, because you need to be able to identify who's going to benefit from them as well. But I suppose I probably would like to see more focus, if we could, on targeting orphan developments of new treatments for rare diseases towards the pediatric population.
Okay.
Particularly as, I mean, quite a few of them are life limiting. I mean, children are dying at quite a young age.
Yes.
And these are lifelong chronic conditions as well.
Right.
And not that a smallish proportion have their onset in adulthood.
And they have a further regulation, the pediatrics regulation, and some additional policy mechanisms too that for evaluation. Now we're just coming up to time to close the symposium, which Timo will do in a moment. But Turkel, you raised your hand, and it would be our pleasure to let you have the final word about the future of orphan drug innovation, commenting on what some of the panelists have said, or just your own thoughts about what you'd like to see or what you expect to see in the next.
Well, my view is that we have the potential to do enormous progress in the area of rare diseases due to the scientific developments we have seen over the last 10 years in genome research. And we need to take stock of it. It seems not to be attractive enough at this point, and there seem to be a number of issues related to the uptake of the products which do be developed. But I think we owe ourselves to actually try to establish a kind of ecosystem which could favor that development, including the regulatory aspects. But I was very happy to hear what Sarah said about newborn screening. And there again, we have to see that the kind of rules that we are living by at this moment do not really take into account where we are with scientific progress. And for neonatal screening, it seems that we are still sticking to the old rule that if there is no treatment, then we shouldn't do it. But for patients, it's actually, in most cases, most relevant to know. And for research and for the development of drugs, having patients diagnosed at an early point is of significant benefit. So I very much support that idea and hope that we will, in the coming years, be able to discuss that more in depth. Thank you.
Fascinating. Excellent. Well, thank you very much to our three panelists, but I'll pass over to Timo to close the proceedings for today.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and fascinating indeed. An absolutely crucial topic in biomedical innovation. And as Turkel said, let's really try to use the new possibilities as good as we can. I also like that you used the word ecosystem, because what we saw today really is that there are not many, there are many push and pull tools we have to consider. It's also almost a systemic challenge that we have to consider, like in other areas, like, for example, antimicrobial resistance, I think, which is, of course, different from the orphan drug problem area. But I think the opportunities are too great to not see how can we improve the system, how can we do this by using different tools. And this also involves so many legal areas, as we have seen today, not only the regulatory system, but also, for example, competition law. We touched upon that. If we talk about making better use of the data, we can think about many other legal areas that come into that, such as privacy regulation and so on and so on. So I think this is absolutely fascinating. I'm so thankful for all the speakers, for the great organization of this event by my dear colleagues at the LML in Cambridge, and Kathy and her great team with Matt Jordan really organizing this in a very nice way. Our funder, the Novo Nordisk Foundation, and of course our wonderful audience who has really also contributed with very, very good questions, which were then replied by our esteemed expert panel here. So without you and your input, this event would not have been possible or worthwhile. So thank you for coming, and we hope you've enjoyed it. And yes, thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to listen to the discussion and all the expertise that we could combine here. So having that in mind, I'm looking forward to an improved orphan drug system. And I think if we pull our forces together, we can achieve that. Thank you very much. And have a nice weekend as well.
Thank you. And all the best, everyone. And we look forward to you joining us on another occasion.
Thank you.